Okay, today's stuff we're going to be learning is Yevamot Kafhe. Before we start, I just want to say that if you remember when we started Masechet Yevamot and we were involved in all those super complicated cases, and then all of a sudden we had this respite almost where we were in all these cases of stories and interesting things. So now we have a bit of a different one. It isn't stories, but this is a clear break from the action of Yevamot, and we're into sugyot, which are super, super interesting in terms of rumors and how we deal with rumors and how we deal with people cheating on other people and all sorts of really interesting things that we're going to see. And in fact, I'll recommend, it should go up later today, hopefully in the next few hours, Gefet actually delves into this topic in a very interesting manner. So recommend it also to listen to the extra content, because this is a sugya that has extreme relevance in terms of how much can we get involved and force people to divorce each other and all sorts of issues between, issues related. We're going to get to Aguna and how the halacha tried to go out of their way to make things easier for women who are stuck in an Aguna situation. Here we mean Aguna where her husband is possibly not alive anymore and we don't know. And we're going to have all sorts of really interesting things, which is going to continue into part of tomorrow's daf as well. The real issue is going to become like, do we suspect that certain people are doing things because they want to marry a woman and they want to get her divorced? And do we not allow them to marry the person? Very fascinating topics. So it's kind of nice to have a little bit of a break from the Yibum stuff. We will get back to it tomorrow. No worries. For those who are loving all the Yibum stuff and for those struggling, just remember the Gemara every few dapim kind of adds something out of the ordinary, different, and, maybe just to keep us going. Okay, today's daf dedication. Today's daf is sponsored by Elisheva Gray in honor of Aviv Zorenberg. Mazal tov to my dear teacher and friend on the birth of your new book. Toda rabah for continuing to illuminate the pages of Torah with your unique voice, your grace, and your deep well of Jewish and worldly wisdom. Mazal tov, and may you go from strength to strength. Okay, I'm going to do a little bit of review of the end of yesterday's daf because we did it kind of quickly, and I'm going to organize it a little bit better than I did yesterday. So we started with this case of Hanit Anal Eshetish. Someone is suspected of being with another woman. Now, we said, right, the Mishnah split, and I want to remind you, because we're going to get back to both these cases today, between you're suspected of having slept with a shifcha or a dovedet kochavim, right, a Gentile woman or a maid servant who's not Jewish, and then you want to marry her after she converts or gets freed. We don't allow you to, but if you did, we don't force you to get divorced. As opposed to if you're suspected of having slept with somebody else while you're married, then what does the Mishnah say? Right? It says, I just want to read it inside, and now I'm losing where the Mishnah is. Oh, here. No? Oh, here. It's at the top of Kaf Dalet Amud Bet. It says, Hotzi'u, if they Hotzi'u mitachat yado, af al pi shekanas yotzi. If she gets divorced from her original husband, right? In other words, votzi'ua. We learned yesterday that it's the court comes in and forces her to get divorced from her previous husband. If she marries this guy that she was then suspected of being with, even if he marries her, he has to divorce her. This is a very strict halacha. This is what we call asur labal, asur laboel. If a woman commits adultery, she's forbidden both to her original husband and to the person who she's suspected of having adultery or she did adultery with. So now here comes the tricky part, which is we don't know. And this is where Rav comes in and says, this is clearly when we have witnesses, right? Because the whole issue is, can we force her to get divorced from her husband and then also divorced from this new person based on a rumor alone, right? So Rav says, no, it's only with witnesses. To that, Rav Sheshet said, no way, you can't possibly be talking about, you must have been sleeping when you said that, can't possibly be, because even a rumor is enough. Now, I want you to know there's a huge machloket rishonim, okay? There's all who take different sides. It's a big debate here, and in Gefet, they go much more into it, so I recommend listening once it goes up on our site. Are we talking about Asur Labal and Asur Laboa, both, that even based on rumor alone, based on Rav Sheshet and what we're going to see in the continuation, when we say based on rumor alone, do we mean that you can actually force her to get divorced from her husband? Or is it only in the case where if she did get divorced from her husband and marries this other guy, we force him to divorce her? Is it just focusing on the Boel, the second guy? Or is it even, do we force her with her husband? There's a bit of a debate about this, and a very important debate, because again, it's all about how seriously can we take these rumors and how much can we intervene, right? Definitely, she's going to be forbidden to both when there's witnesses, but when there's no witnesses, Can we go that far? Rashi thinks we can. Rashi thinks whenever we're going to say asur laboel, asur labal, it goes hand in hand. Okay, so I'll leave it for you to delve into it more in depth. It's a very interesting topic. But right now, we're just going to kind of go with one reading of the Gemara. So we started off with Rav, who basically said, this is only with witnesses. Then came Rav Sheshet and said, you're definitely off base here. And that's because of this Breita that we saw, where it said, if she marries someone in the interim, then she can actually stay married to the second guy if she marries him. So we say, if there were witnesses, for sure, that wouldn't, right? We would never allow her to marry the guy who she had adultery with. So it must be there weren't witnesses. Comes Rav and he says, that doesn't prove anything, because the chiddush there was, even though there were witnesses, she still, even though there weren't witnesses, she still can't actually marry him, even if she was with someone in the interim. It's only if she did, we don't force her to divorce. But that was talking about a different thing. That was the first answer. Then that was really the answer. We're going to get to a second answer in a little bit. No, the structure is like this. Rav Sheshet brings a Breita to contradict. We answer it. We say, talking about a different case. Then, right, one was Eidim, one wasn't Eidim. Number two, and they don't contradict. Number two, we're going to bring another Breita, which we already saw yesterday, and we're going to bring two answers to that Breita. The second one is going to answer both questions of both Breita. Okay, so Meitide. So let's just go back over this case. About 12 lines from the bottom of yesterday's daf. This Breita brought in this into issue that we have to consider other things as well. But we have to look at the whole picture here, which is also fascinating in and of itself. We need to check, are we basically going to cause her kids to be mamzeret? If she has kids from her first husband, we're going to be much more lenient. Now, obviously, in which case are we going to be lenient? When there are no witnesses, right? So now it seems like when there's no witnesses and there's no children from the first marriage, we're going to force her to get divorced from her husband, and obviously not stay married to the second guy, which obviously means that it's talking about when there aren't witnesses. So another contradiction against Rav, when there aren't witnesses, we can force him to divorce her. So, right, only when there are children do we say, well, then we're not going to force you to get divorced based on rumor alone. And then that Breita said, but if there's Eidim, then we don't care about the children. But once you have witnesses, it's right, two paths. If there's witnesses, there's nothing to talk about. Obviously, she has to get divorced. But if there aren't, then it's going to depend whether she has children or not. Which again is being very sensitive to the situation. So now they say, Rav doesn't have a problem with that. He says, I agree with that Breita, but I just think that the Mishnah was giving the case of Eidim, and right, regardless of whether you had children or not. But you could have also said the Mishnah was talking about no Eidim and no children, and then we would also force you to divorce. So that's what they say, that he could have said that, he could have said that. So now they say, so why did Rav choose that and not that? And that's because he used the language hotzi uha, which we're going to come back to later as well. Hotzi uha means that Beit Din forced the first husband to divorce. That means forcing, right? The Beit Din forces, there must have been witnesses. And that's why he says that the Mishnah was witnesses, but he doesn't disagree with that other Breita. Now the Gemara says, we can give another answer. Ibait Ema. This is where our daf starts. Okay, we're at the very bottom, 5 lines from the bottom of Kaftalat Amud Bet. Alternatively, you could say Hani Matniata. The second answer to the second question really is going to answer both questions, which is these two Breita you brought to question Rav. You could say Rebbe. You could very simply say it's Rebbe's opinion, and Rav doesn't agree with Rebbe. Okay, now Rebbe's a Tana, Rav's an Amora. Generally, Amoraim can't just disagree with Tanaim unless you're Rav. Rav has unique status. He was the first Amora, and he was a very prominent one. And he has status that if he wants to, he can disagree with an Amora. It's called Rav Tanahu Upali. He has status like a Tana, and he can argue over Tanaitic opinion. So we can easily say our Mishnah, according to Rav, is with witnesses, and that's the way Rav understands it. And our Mishnah doesn't hold by Rebbe. Our Mishnah doesn't take rumors seriously. Our Mishnah doesn't think that you can force a woman to get divorced from her husband and divorce from her Boel, right? From the second husband, the second guy who married her, who she was suspected of having relations with, based on rumor alone. Okay, but Rebbe thinks you can, and here's Rebbe. Ditanya, Rochel Yotzei, here we're going to get some interesting scenarios, ones you can imagine happening. Okay, hopefully not in your life, but Rochel Yotzei v'isha chogeret besinar. Guy walks into his house, he sees the peddler, like the peddlers used to go from door to door in some cases. He sees the peddler in his house selling, it's usually a Rochel is someone who sells perfumes, sees the guy selling perfumes in his house, and he sees his wife putting on her clothes. Okay. Like some people say it's kind of pants. Some people say it's some sort of smock, some sort of garment that it looks like she's getting dressed as the husband walks in the house. So Rebbe says, this is pretty disgusting, right? And pretty likely that something happened here. Teitse, we forced her to get divorced, right? We forced him to divorce her based on this rumor, right? Again, it's not exactly a rumor, but it's a suspicion, okay? Where we don't really know what happened. Furthermore, he gives a few other cases. Kilab was their canopy beds. So if you find saliva on the top of the bed, now whether it means top above, and then maybe someone was lying on the bed and spit, or maybe it means the upper part of the bed. Okay, now whether it's actually saliva, okay, now what would it mean? It would mean, well, the saliva was still moist, and it means someone was in the bed recently, right? If it was his saliva from, the morning, it wouldn't still be moist. So that's one thing. Some people say it's a euphemism for semen. Find semen on the bed, that obviously the guy rubbed his semen on the canopy when he got out of bed, and that's what we're talking about. If you find it, then I'm a Rebbe, right? This is pretty obvious. Something happened here, or again, you're not really sure, but there's some sort of evidence, right? Maybe circumstantial evidence, but evidence. Min alim hafuchim tachan hamita. This one's a little tricky to understand, and even the Gemara struggles to understand it. He finds shoes flipped under the bed. This reminds us of that crazy story where the guy's shoes were going the wrong direction, and then they caused that whole thing, the maaseh shaya, that then they said you can't wear spiked sandals. Anyway, it's somehow a little bit reminiscent of that story, but you find shoes in the wrong direction underneath the bed. Right? Evidence someone left their shoes. Some people say he was rushing out of bed, in the bed, and he dropped his shoes, or, something. It was done in haste because, he was worried the husband was going to come home. So somehow maybe it's something having to do with that. Anyway, the Gemara says, if you find shoes, well, right, like Cinderella, go find who fits the shoe, and then you'll know if they were his shoes or not. So it seems that's pretty clear. Right. If his shoes are under your bed, then you know that there's something up, right? Saliva, semen, maybe it was something else. Maybe it was, there was a leak in the ceiling. I don't know. Maybe the liquid came from something else, but this is pretty clear. Someone left their shoes in your bedroom, right? It reminds me also of the Yosef story where she ends up with his cloak, and then she can prove that it was him, right? So there's basically much more evidence here. He was in the bedroom. Ela makom alim hafuchim. Okay, he sees maybe, again, unclear, there's different explanations, but maybe there's footprints in the bed in a place where normally the shoes don't go, or, there's something that doesn't look right in the room. Okay, something's a little bit off about the shoes. Some people say it was that the shoes were in her place, not her shoes were in the wrong place. They were where his shoes go. All different explanations are brought. Maybe it could teach you a little bit about what their customs were about, they had shoes under their beds and how they did it. Anyway, so what do you see here? The main thing is that Rebbe is concerned about rumors, and you can just say that's Rebbe's opinion. These braytot that we brought before hold like Rebbe, and Rav doesn't think that we hold by these, unclear evidence. Comes the Gemara and says a very odd statement. Hilchata kavatei de Rav, v'hilchata kavatei de Rebbe. We paskin like both of them. Okay, that's super confusing. It's like saying which way do you go, and you point your fingers in both directions. So kashe hilchata. The Gemara obviously says that sounds quite difficult. You're basically saying itself in the opposite. Lo kashya, ha bekala de pasik, ha bekala de lo pasik. We've had this term before. I don't remember exactly in what context, but actually I can look right here on moed katan. So it wasn't so long ago. There's a kol. Kol again is a rumor, right? Because kol, voice, it's rumors. Shmu'ah in Hebrew, the word is to hear. Right? It's very interesting. The etymology of the word in Hebrew all has to do with hearing something, a voice, right? It's all from hearing. That's what a rumor is. So, right, the word rumor doesn't have that kind, right? Doesn't have the root in the Hebrew language. It's very interesting. It comes from shmu'ah, lishmoah, to hear, or this call of a voice. So he says, if it's a kol de pasik, if it's a rumor that's stopped. Okay, what exactly stop means, it's not so clear. The Gemara is going to go into it, although Rashi says here, it means that there was a rumor and then there was a counter rumor. Okay, a rumor that said it was false, even though the Gemara definitely doesn't seem to say that. So if it was a rumor that stopped, then we're going to hold like Rav that you need witnesses. But habakala de lo pasik, if it's a continuous rumor, then we're going to hold like Rebbe and take it seriously. So kala de lo pasik, but now they're going to say, if it's a call that doesn't end, and even though there's no witnesses, we're going to hold like Rabbi and be concerned. If it's a kala de pasik, a rumor that stops, vi'ika edim kirav, and then only if there's edim are we going to hold, right? Are we going to say it's a problem? As Rav says. So what's a call that doesn't end, right? What does that mean? For how long does it have to go for? Remember Abaye's mother, it's not really his mother, it's his, thank you, Debbie Veer. Okay, the etymology of rumor is in French. Is that what you're saying? That in French it means noise? That's what you're saying about the etymology, if I understood you correctly. So it actually comes from noise. So there you have it. So it does. Okay. Thank you for correcting me. Okay. So now the aim is, if you remember his nursemaid or his, right, however you call it, it was a woman who took care of him because his mother was dead. Mother died in childbirth. She always taught him all sorts of interesting things that he loves to quote. So one thing he taught her was, Dumi de mata yoma upalga. A rumor in the city is considered a day and a half. So if it's a rumor de lo pasik, that's a rumor de lo pasik. If it lasts for a day and a half, it doesn't last that long, then we're going to hold like Rav that you need witnesses. And even that, ela de lo pasik beni beni. It has to be a continuous rumor. Ava pasak beni beni ha pasak. Again, that might mean, like Rashi says, there was a counter rumor. Someone said that's not true, and then they said it is true, and they said it's not true, right? Then we're not going to accept it, even if it continued for a day and a half. And lo maran ela de lo pasak machma ira. Okay, one of the fascinating things about the sugya is that it all has to do with how we view human behavior, people spreading rumors, how we treat them in a court of law, right? Or in a system of law. So one of the things we always have to consider is, where is this rumor coming from? So if the rumor starts and then immediately stops, but it stops because of because of fear. Let's say the rumor was about one of these, big tough guys who has a lot of bodyguards who can go, beat up people who he doesn't like. So if Pasak Mahmad Yirah, if they're scared of him and he threatened them that they better stop talking about him, well, that's not considered a rumor that stopped, because it obviously stopped just because they're scared of him. Mahmad Yirah, because they're fearful, that's why it stopped. That doesn't count as a rumor that stops. Here's another important consideration. Why did the rumor get started in the first place? Sometimes people have enemies, and their enemies spread rumors about them. And then if there are people who have enemies, then you don't necessarily believe their rumors, right? So therefore, if you have enemies, you can assume that your enemies are the ones who spread the rumor, in which case we don't take the rumor seriously. So even though we've said that according to Rebbe, we take rumors seriously, and then we even paskin that way, depending on the situation, right? If the rumor continues, we argue in that, then the question becomes, right, there's almost a scale of a rumor, and then how seriously do we take the rumor? So even though Rav says Edim, we in the end paskin somewhere in between Rav and Rebbe. But certain rumors that continue and don't have any other factors affecting it, or maybe they do have factors affecting it, they stop, but it's only out of fear. So we're going to take those rumors seriously. And again, then the question becomes, according to the Psak Halacha here, do we mean that we can even force her to get divorced from her first husband? And this is the real issue that Rishonim struggle with. In fact, there's a huge chart in the Koren about all the different, not all of them, I'm sure, but the many different Rishonim opinions about this topic. You can use it as a summary if you want, about, are we talking about, even based on a rumor, do we allow you to force her to get divorced from her husband? Or are we only talking about if she were to get divorced or he died and she married this guy who she was suspected of, do we force him to divorce her? Okay, so there's a big debate here, which is a very interesting debate. T'nanatam. Now we're going to quote a Mishnah in Gitin and connect it very soon to our Mishnah. Hamotziat ishto mishum shem ra. Husband, here's another very interesting issue. Divorces his wife because he suspects her of having cheated on him. Lo yachzir, we don't allow him to remarry her. This is a fascinating issue. Why? So there could be a number of reasons. Number one, the most common one that the commentaries talk about is we're worried that what happens if she'll go get married to somebody else, and then he'll come back and say, oh, listen, I found out it wasn't really true. I suspected you of cheating, but it wasn't really true. I want to marry you again, right? Now she's already married to someone else. You could, right? It would create a problem. And theoretically, you could claim maybe my get was given under false pretenses. She's already married. She has children, right? We definitely don't want to get into a situation like that. But also, I think it's a way of preventing husbands from divorcing their wives out of anger and suspecting them that they're cheating on them, right? And we're going to see this whole theory in the Sota as well, which seems to be the whole Sota ceremony is really preventing a few things, but of them, a man from getting too suspicious of his wife. They tell him, okay, you want to, well, you have to do this and you have to do that. And you have to go through, yes, it's humiliating for her, but also you'll see that when we get to Sota, there's many things in the process to be humiliating to him as well. So it's a warning to a husband, beware, in a way to protect the woman. So they basically say, if you divorce her for those reasons, you will not ever be able to remarry her. Mishum neder, if it's because she's takes too many vows, and he doesn't like that about her, and he says you're vowing too much. I don't want a woman who has all these vows upon her. Then lo yachzir. Okay, he also can't take her back. Shalach le rabba, right? It's another way of, again, he gets angry at her. You're always doing this, and we don't want him to just randomly divorce her, so we don't allow. So shalach le rabba bar Huna le rabba bar Rav Nachman. He sends the following question: Vilamdenu Rabbeinu kanas ma'ushi yotzi. Now it says he can't remarry her. What if he does? Do we make him get divorced? Amar le Tanina, let's learn it from our Mishnah. Hanit ana leshetish botziu mitachat yedo afa pishchanas yotzi. Look, we compare it to the case where, again, she was suspected of cheating. And again, if you go not with Rav's opinion, and we basically force him to, the second guy marries her, we force him to divorce her. Now, it's not exactly a fair comparison. One is the original husband who remarries his wife, and one is the person she was suspected of cheating with who marries his wife, and then we force him to divorce her. So it's not exactly a fair comparison, but right now they compare them as if they're the same. So Amar Lei responds to him, Midame, are these really similar? Right? So again, let's get the people straight. Rabba Bar Huna asked the question. Rabba Bar Rav Nachman answered it and compared the cases. And Rabba Bar Rav Huna says to Rabba Rav Nachman, are these two similar? Hatam hotziua, hacha hotziah. In the first case, how they get divorced in the first place? The Beit Din forced based on the rumor or based on witnesses. Whereas in this case, the husband himself decided on his own to divorce her. So that might not be as strong as, right, to prevent the next marriage, might not be as strong. The Rabba Bar Rav Nachman, why do you think to compare them? Now we see that there was a different version. We used that as a proof for Rav's opinion yesterday, right? And we started with it today. Because it said Hotzi'ua meant it was the court, which means there must have been witnesses. But apparently there were different versions of the text. And some people said Hotzi'ah, which means if the man happened to divorce her, the first husband, then, right, which would obviously, by the way, affect the machloket we talked about in the Rishonim, about whether it's that she has to get divorced from her first husband, or maybe it's just if the first husband divorced her and she married the second guy, then the second guy has to divorce her. So see how that girsa would affect how we read things. But then he continues to question him, Rabbi Rav Huna, and says, one is talking about the original husband, and the other time about the guy who she was suspected of cheating with. There's a big difference. We can force the guy who she was suspected of cheating with to divorce her, but it doesn't necessarily mean a husband who overly suspected his wife, and remarries her, does he have to divorce her? That's something different. So then he says, Amarle, Shapir Dame Hadadu. No, they really are similar and can be compared. Comes Rav Nachman. Both of them, basically, the rabbis come in and say, right, and this assuming you say, let's say it's not witnesses, the rabbis come and say, there's something not right here. We're going to force you to divorce her. The imkanas yotzi. And we're going to force you in the first case for the man suspected of cheating with her not to marry her. And if you go ahead and go against the rabbi's words, well, we're going to force you to divorce her. So likewise here, hachanami amre rabbanan, it was a rabbinic ordinance to say to this guy, listen, you can't remarry her for whatever reason it is, right? The reasons we mentioned. V'im kanas yotzi, but if he does, then he has to divorce her, basically. So in other words, they didn't say that, but they're saying if both of these are the rabbis coming and saying, we don't want you to marry these women, either the Boel or the Baal, right? The Boel is the one who was cheating with her, and the Baal is the original husband who suspected his wife of cheating. In both cases, the rabbis came and said, you can't marry these women. If in one case, they said, not only can you not marry, but if you do, you have to divorce, we're going to assume the same thing applies here. So Rabbi Bar Rav Nachman is basically saying they're similar enough that I think you can compare them because they're similar in the sense that they're rabbinic ordinances not to marry particular people. Philohi, but then the Gemara rejects his answer and says it's not true. Hatam alume alma lakale. Hacha amrinan kambe bekala valete. There's a third major difference. We already brought up two differences. Now we're going to get a third. In the first case in our Mishnah, the fact that he marries her strengthens the rumor. So all the more so, we're going to say, since we didn't allow him to marry her in the first place because of the rumor. And by his marrying her, he's strengthening the rumor. That's definitely a reason to force him to divorce her. But here he says, listen, I checked into the rumor. It turns out it's not true. I want to remarry you. He remarries her. There we weaken the rumor. So all the more so, in that case, we should actually let him stay married to her. It really shouldn't be a problem because we basically gotten rid of the kol, because he's basically saying, whatever rumor I heard, well, it turned out not to be true, and therefore I want to stay married to you. So that's why he distinguishes the cases. And again, nobody will say he's allowed to marry her, but if he does anyway, according to this, it seems like he'd be allowed to stay married. Okay, now this Mishnah and the next Mishnah are going to bring a bunch of cases where a person, okay, by the way, I forgot to mention, how did we get here in the first place? Why are we off on this tangent? So either, you could claim, okay, they wanted a little break from Yibum. They were looking for some sort of out to kind of break things up. But there's another potential reason, which is in the first Mishnah of the parak, we had this crazy case with who betrothed who, and we don't know which one, and all this stuff case. And there was all these cases where we said, well, if they married her anyway, we don't force them to divorce. And then we had the Mishnah that said we start with the older one to do Yibum, but if the younger one does it anyway, it's okay. So there's all these cases where they did it anyway, and it's okay. From that, we got to, if you're suspected of having a relationship with a shifcha or an oved kochavim, and then you married her, right, once she converts, then we allow it, okay? It's the same thing. If you do it anyway, you shouldn't marry her, but if you do it anyway, we allow you to remain married. So it's the same idea here. And then they go off on all these cases where we don't allow you to stay married, right? That was the case where she was suspected of actually being with this other man. So then, right, while she's an Eshet Ish, that we take much more seriously. Now, we're going to see other cases where we don't allow, and here they actually don't talk about, we've already gone a little bit off on a tangent, we don't talk about what if he marries her anyway, although the Gemara will ask that question eventually. But now we get to cases where we suspect someone of doing something out of self-interest, and therefore we don't allow, okay, we're going to allow him, we're going to accept his testimony to permit a woman to get married, to say she's divorced or her husband died or something like that. But she can marry everyone in the world except for him, because we're worried that he's doing it out of self-interest. So now let's read. Hamivi get mi medinat hayam va'amar b'fanai nechtav b'fanai nechtam. I don't want to get into this right now. This is a whole issue we're going to learn very in depth when we get to Gittin, which is anyone who brings a get from overseas, what exactly overseas is, what exactly, when you don't do this, a whole big discussion in Gittin. But if you bring a get from overseas, you have, again, whatever that means, you have to, besides that he has a get that has signatures of the witnesses on it, he needs to say the declaration, b'fanai nechtav b'fanai nechtam. This would machloket Rabba and Rava, what this is for, either because maybe it's far away and you won't be able to have edim to verify the signatures. So he has to say, I saw this happen and I know it's legit, or because the edim in overseas, as opposed to Israel, are not, they don't know this halacha of lishma, okay, which the get has to be written for his name and her name specifically. We'll get into all that. And because of that, we're worried that maybe it wasn't done lishma. So this guy's basically testifying it was. Anyway, we'll get to all that in Giti. So someone comes from Medina Hayam. Now, if he doesn't say, b'fanai nechtav, b'fanai nechtam, they will not accept this get. So he brings a get. Let's say the wife's living here, the husband's living abroad somewhere. They bring her the get, and he says, b'fanai nechtav, b'fanai nechtam. So she can get married based on his declaration only. Without him, she wouldn't be able to get married. So lo yisat ishto. It's actually weird. Ishto. He can't marry the woman of that man. Okay. He can't marry this woman. Okay. Anyone else can marry her, but not him, because the whole testimony is based on his testimony. Maybe he's lying because he wants it for himself. So we believe him, but not to marry her because we don't want him to do it out of self-interest. What if he says, mate, I saw your husband died. Okay. One witness. Now this is famous that we accept if someone goes abroad, never shows up, right? We accept one witness's testimony normally we need two to say, this is okay. He's dead in order to allow the woman to remarry. This is mishum iguna, akilu be Rabbanan, because of iguna situations. We don't want her to remain forever bound to this man when he's not even alive. So we'll accept one witness's testimony. We'll see further on the Gemara. Maybe I'll already tell you now that when we get to the sugya inside and we learn it more, and actually its sources in Yibum, in Yevamot, not in Yibum specifically, in Yevamot and in our Masechet, they're basically going to assume that the reason we accept one witness's testimony is not just because we're going to be Mekel, but there's an assumption that a woman wouldn't get remarried. Okay, imagine yourself in that situation. You're going to search far and wide to make sure your husband's really not alive before you get married. Number one, you don't really want to get married if you're really an eshet ish. And number two, right, you probably love your husband and want to find him. So you're going to not leave any stone unturned. And therefore, we have a combination of his testimony and her interest, we assume. Again, this whole sugya is all about human assumptions, right? We can assume, right, if someone's your enemy, they might start a rumor against you. There's all sorts of assumptions we make here in the sugya about human behavior, which is why I love the sugya, because I think, and many sugyot take into account what we assume humans will do. And it's just very interesting to see how the halacha addresses this. So we assume a woman will check far and wide, and therefore we trust the one witness because it's combined with her interest in making sure he's really dead. So now, the Gemara first starts out with an assumption. And that's why I mentioned this Aguna thing, because you're going to see it in a minute. Oh, sorry, I forgot to read the rest of the Mishnah. Mate, haragtiv, I killed him. Okay, let's say a guy comes to court and says, I killed your husband. So then it's one witness saying he's dead. But he also says, I killed him, which means he's a murderer. We're going to have to get into this and understand it a little better. Haraganuhu, we killed him. Okay, what's the difference between I killed him and we killed him? Okay, we'll see. Lo yisat ishto. All those cases he can't marry, but Rabbi Yehuda disagrees. Rabbi Yehuda omer haragtiv lo tinaseh ishto. Not only can you not marry her, nobody can marry her because we don't accept your testimony, because basically you're a murderer. If you're a murderer, we don't accept your testimony in court. Okay, we're going to get into that whole thing in a few minutes. Haraganuhu, but if Rabbi Yehuda says, if you say we killed him, Tina Seishto. Now, we have no idea why he distinguishes those two cases. We'll have to get to that soon. So the Gemara says, Tamad Medinat Hayam. So the reason in the first part was because it came from afar. If and in that case, you have to have the person say, but if it came from Israel, where we're not relying on him, there you don't need. He's just bringing the get. You don't need him to say, if it was written before me, it was signed before me. Then you're not relying on him. You decide to show. Sounds like you would assume. Then no problem, because it's not because of him that we're letting this woman get married. It's because there's a get, right? So if that's the case, to Amar Mar, in other words, it's not only on him. It's on the fact that he has a get in his hand. So Damar Mar, Vahamet, what about if someone dies? Delav aleka samchina. We're not relying exclusively on the person. Even though it seems like we are, we're not. If one witness comes and says, I saw your husband die, this is what I already told you. She checks and will only get married if she's really sure that he's dead. She does her own checking. And yet it says, can't marry his wife, even though, right, he can't marry this woman. He should be able to marry the woman because it's not only relying on him, just like if he brings the get in Israel, where they're not really relying on him. So they say, no, there's a big difference between a get and an aguna situation here where the man is dead and we don't know if he's really dead. Hatam leika ktava. We have a get to show for it with signatures on it. That's not the same as someone saying your husband died and she checks into it. That's not the same thing. Titnan, as it says in the Mishnah, ma ben get lemita. What's the difference between get and death? Shaktav mochiach. Okay, we have much better proof when it comes to a get because he is holding a document signed by witnesses. So that gives it a lot more validity. And that's why in the get case, if it was in Israel and he brought the get, he'd be allowed to marry her. But if he says he died, he wouldn't be allowed to marry her. Now we get to a whole fascinating story, which we're going to learn much more when we get to Nezikin and Sanhedrin in terms of witnesses and all that and who we accept. I say, the guy comes into court, he says, I killed her. We're going to accept his testimony. And I killed her husband. We're going to accept his testimony when it comes to the woman. She's free to marry anyone she wants, just not him. So now they say, you have a problem with something Rabbi Yosef says. Rabbi Yosef. You say somebody sodomized me, right? They raped me. Okay. Okay, it's a death penalty for this. And he and another witness can testify, even though he's involved, right? He says, I was raped. We accept his testimony in court, and the two together can cause the person to be killed. Lirtsoni, if I did it willingly, so now what's he doing? He's saying, I was involved in Mishkav Zachor, right? A homosexual relationship. Okay, I'm not getting into this whole topic of homosexuality now. It's a whole big topic. We have 10 minutes left to Daf. We're definitely not attacking this topic right now, but we're going by what it says in the Torah here. you say I was a willing partner, then Rashahu. He becomes a Rasha, according to the Torah, right? It's called a Toiva, and something despicable. You can't accept a Rasha to be a witness, right? We're going to get into this in Sanhedrin, all the people who can't be witnesses. So you can't accept his testimony at all. So how can we possibly accept his testimony when he says, I murdered someone based on what Rav Yosef said? We're going to have a kind of circular type of reasoning here. We're going to start with one thing, then we're going to end with a different thing. If you want to say, Shani Eduti Shah, maybe this is right? Okay, this is, I want to be clear. This is the people are being killed because they were involved in homosexual relations together, a sexual relationship. That's the issue of the death penalty here, not the rape specifically. Okay, just to be clear. Even though that's obviously horrible, but in the Torah, that's not the issue here. So maybe this is all, we're being lenient here because of Edut Isha. And that's why we'll accept it, him saying, I killed him, even though we wouldn't accept it in another case where he'd be considered a Rasha. But you can't say that because Hama Rav Menashe, going down Amabek, Kazlan de Divrahim, Kasher le Edut Isha, Kazlan de Divrei Torah, Pasul le Edut Isha. Rav Menashe said, we're willing to be lenient here. When it comes to freeing up a woman and not allowing her to be, right, not having her stuck in a state where she's an aguna and she's stuck with a husband who's not even alive anymore, we will accept testimony of people who are disqualified for testimony on a rabbinic level, but not ones on a Torah level. So again, this was a Torah crime, which would make him a Rasha according to Torah law, not rabbinic law. We'll get into Sanhedrin and we'll see what's rabbinic, what's Torah. But the point is, there's obviously a distinction where the rabbis were more stringent. Those stringencies we can get rid of, but we can't get rid of stringencies by Torah law. So you can easily, and that was a problem with what Rav Menashe said. But now we can just say, we can put Rav Menashe aside and just say, name a Rav Menashe, Damak Rabbi Yehuda. This is what the machloket in the Mishnah is about. The Mishnah said, Haragti, we accept his testimony about him, about the husband, that he's dead, but we don't accept the testimony to allow him to marry the woman. Came Rabbi Yehuda and said, we don't accept this testimony at all. Must be Rav Menashe, in other words, it's Rav Menashe's later. Rav Menashe holds like Rabbi Yehuda, that we don't accept this testimony at all because he's a Rasha, right? And therefore, but Rav Yosef, who said we generally don't accept his testimony, would say in this case, Mishum aguna akilu be'Rabbanan. We'll make an exception. But now they reject that and they say, we're going to come back to this, but right now we're going to reject it. That's why I said it's circular. We're going to eventually come back to that. It's Rav Yosef and it's because it's a guna. But right now we're going to say, no, maybe Rav Menashe, Rav Menashe could say, no, don't peg me into a corner and say, you hold like this one person against the rabbis. No, I can explain myself according to the rabbis as well. He could say the following. The rabbis here hold like Rava and not like Rav Yosef. Again, Rava and Rav Yosef are later, but the point is we're explaining the Tanaim according to through the lens of the Amoraim. Tama Rava says, Adam karov etzel atzmo, ve'ein Adam mesim atzmo rasha. A person, who's more karov, relative than yourself, right? So you can't testify about yourself in court. Now, this guy testified about himself in court. But what do we say? And they don't use the words, but in the sugya where it comes up elsewhere, they use the words plagin and dibure. We split his words. He said two things, really. He said, number one, I killed him. We don't believe him that he's a murderer because again, assumptions about human behavior. Nobody would come into a court and say, I'm an evil person. I did something terrible that would get me the death penalty, right? Who would do that? So we don't believe him regarding himself, but we do believe him that the guy was murdered. Okay, we split it. Now, it's hard to split these words, really, right? Sometimes plagin and diburi is easy because you can split it. Ploni riva'ani leon si. Ploni riva'uni, he, right, was engaged in sodomy. Lirtsoni, we can ignore the lirtsoni part, right? We can say, oh, well, I was involved in and willingly. We can put that aside. Here, it's a little bit more difficult because if he's murdered and I murdered him, right? But still, you could see how one could split. We say, we accept the fact that he's dead. We just don't accept the fact that you murdered him. And then you could say that Rav Menashe will hold, right? Even though we don't generally accept a Rasha, but the reason why we accept it here is because he's not really a Rasha, because we don't allow anyone to turn themselves into a Rasha. Since he's not a Rasha, we'll believe at least the part that's not about him. Lema Rav Yosef to Amak Rabbi Yehuda. So they say, wait. And then according to this, Rav Yosef, who says, Ploni Rava'ani Lirtsoni, we don't accept it at all. he's holding like Rabbi Yehuda, that we won't accept it at all. So we kind of flip, right? We say Rabbi Yosef's the one who holds like Rabbi Yehuda. But no, we're now going to go back to where we started. Amar l'cha Rabbi Yosef, Anada Amar afilu l'Rabbanan, Shani Yidudi Shada Kilu Barabanan. I told you we get back to this. No, even though he says it in the sodomy case, he won't say it in this case because Shani Yidudi Shad. We're going to be more lenient here. And even though we don't accept it normally, we will accept it here in order to be lenient to women so that they could get remarried. And then you'd have to put Rabbi Nasha in the category of Rabbi Yehuda. Okay, and then that would be the split between them. Did they hold like Rabbi Yosef or did they hold like Rabbi Menashe? Again, it's putting later people into the eyes of the earlier people, but it's explaining it that way. Now we get to Haraktiv, Haragenuhu Tinase. So now why does Rabbi Yehuda distinguish between Haraktiv, I killed, we don't accept, but we killed, we do accept. So we're basically going to reinterpret we killed. It doesn't mean I was involved with a mob of people who killed her. No. What's the difference? I'm a Rav Yehuda be'omer ani hayiti im horgav. I was with those who murdered, meaning I witnessed the murder. I saw it. I was with those people. I wasn't involved. I didn't do it, but I watched it. And that's why he's believed, because he didn't actually murder her. So he's not making himself into a Rasha, right? He's not a Rasha here. V'hatanya, and here's a braita that proves it. Okay, here we're going to have a discussion between Rabbi Yehuda and the rabbis about this issue. And in it, you're going to see that Haragnuhu is clearly a case where he watched what was going on. Amrullah Rabbi Yehuda, there was a case with a robber. Okay, usually listim is someone who does armed robbery. He was about to be hung killed somehow he was about to be killed by the court in this area in Kapotkia. And they said to him, he said to them, okay, as he's about to be murdered, what does he say to them? He gets up and he says, wait, before you kill me, I have one thing to admit. I want everyone to know because I want to be nice on my deathbed, right? And I want to save this woman. I murdered your husband. Okay, so now you know he's dead. Some people say, right, there's different versions what exactly he said when I was going into load or when he was going into load. Either way, it doesn't really matter for our purposes. And they accepted his testimony. So what do you see? A Rasha, right? This goes against Rabbi Yehuda. They accepted his testimony. So Amar Lahem, Rabbi Yehuda says to them, Misham B'raya, you want to prove it from there? Be'omel, you got the case wrong. He said the following, Ani ayiti im horgav. This is your proof. Haraganuhu, Rabbi Yehuda agrees. I was with the people who murdered him. To which they say, V'halistim katane, but it says he was a bandit. He was a bad guy. Well, how could you possibly say he was just witnessing the murder? He was clearly a bad guy. He's about to be killed. So they said, no, he was, caught because of his listiyut, but not that he was actually, such a bad guy. You can't possibly say that. He's about to be killed here, death penalty for bad things he did. Of course, he's a bad guy. He was very likely involved in the murder itself. So they say now, right? This was an anti-Semitic killing, they say. So it's basically Gentiles who were out to get him, and they framed him as a bandit. He wasn't really a bandit. And that's why, and now the story's a little different when he all of a sudden gets up and before they murder him, well, you understand he was a good guy. And he just says, listen, before I die, I got to tell you this one thing, that I witnessed this murder in your husband. Why he didn't say it before, I don't know, but could be it just happened. He didn't have an opportunity and they already, were convicting him, or maybe he was in jail all this time by these Gentiles. Again, this is just an answer. We don't know if this is really what happened, but again, it proves that Haraganuhu is with, I watched it rather than I was a murderer. And that's why Rabbi Yehuda permits it. Okay, next Mishnah. You make a vow. Okay, if a woman makes a vow, I don't want to benefit. My husband cannot benefit from me at all, or I can't benefit from my husband. Either which way, they're not allowed to stay married because there's no such thing as a marriage without benefiting from each other. So she goes to a chacham and says, listen, I want to get rid of my neder. I feel I didn't mean to say it, blah, blah, blah. And he doesn't find her a way out, and he doesn't annul her neder. And basically, that's what it means. He's asaret ha'isha b'neder abala. She took the vow, and he basically said, I can't get rid of it for you. Sorry. And then you have to get divorced. So again, he's responsible for her not being able to get divorced, for her being forced to get divorced. So he can't marry her. But mi'ana, if she did mi'un, remember the young daughter refuses the marriage. If her mother or brother marries her, or she did chalitza in front of him. In other words, he was part of a court where she did miyun or chalitza, which basically means she's free to marry anyone she wants. Then yisa'ena mipnei shehu beitin. He's just functioning as a court, so that's fine. And he's with two other people, so it's fine. So the Gemara first starts with the first thing. Hayitira yisa'ena. If he matirs her, sounds like he could marry her. Let's say he permits her to be with her husband, and then a year later the husband dies, and then he wants to marry her. It sounds like he can't. But b'mayaskina, what's the case? If he's one person by himself doing the neder, mimatse matir. It seems like he forbade her, which means he could have permitted her, which means one person permits a neder. We know. We always do a tarat nedarim in front of three people, not one person. And if you say, if he was with three people and he forbade her, well, then we already know from the end of the Mishnah, it's not a problem. It's not suspicious. So in the end, they say, it really was, he was alone. How could he be matir the neder? Oh, this is very simple. Just like he says in another place, you could have one individual function as a Beit Din of three when it comes to a neder. If he's a specialist, must be a specialist, and that's what we're talking about. So now we have a problem because it sounds like Tama debating. It's because you have three, right? One doesn't work, three does work. What about two? So habitrelo, it sounds like two. No, there's different Mishnah that says, you are a witness that somebody bought a field. You can buy the field from them, or you're a witness, I'll get isha. If you're a witness that somebody bought the field, you can buy the field from him and not, we don't say, oh, maybe you wanted to sign on the thing that he bought it just so that you could buy it from him because he'll sell it to you, or get isha just so that you can marry the woman. No, we're not worried because there's someone else with you. So they say, you're right. Two would be enough to avoid suspicion. But there's a machloket about miyun. Do you have to do it in front of two or three? And this Mishnah is trying to tell you a different halacha that miyun has to be in front of three. Last question for today. If this is what I told you, we're going to get to. It doesn't say what if he marries her anyway. Does he have to divorce her in all these cases that we've been seeing? So Rav Kahana Amar Kanas Motzi, he has to divorce her. Rav Ashi Amar Kanas Eino Motzi. Okay, machloket, yes or no. Tana lehu Rav Zute deber Rav Papi kedever haomer Kanas Eino Motzi. So we have a brayta that supports you don't have to divorce her. Amrule Rabbanan Rav Ashi Gemara Usfara. Is it a tradition or is it by logic? Amar lehu Matnitini says it's simple Mishnah. We learned it from our Mishnah, the one we learned 2 Mishnayot ago. Hanit amishivcha v'nishtachara me'aved kochavim v'nitkaira harei ze lo yichnos. We see with the shivcha and the Yevamot Kochavim that you were suspect of maybe having been with them before, and maybe having ulterior motives, right? And then marrying them. And we say, if you already did it, it's okay. We don't worry about rumors. We're not worried that maybe you did this all, right? Yes, we are enough to prevent you from marrying her, but if you're already married, it's okay. The question I'm going to leave you with is, why didn't we compare it to the Esherish case where we forced him to get married? And Rashi, in fact, brings that up. First Rashi on the daf here, on daf Kafav. And he says there it's different because because she already got divorced from her first husband on account of the rumor, it makes it much worse. And that's why if he marries her, we force him. Whereas here, that wasn't the situation. And therefore, okay, it's one reason. It's a better question than the answer that Rashi gives. But it's a big question why they don't compare it to the other case. But in the end, they say all these cases we can be lenient if you already married her, which goes back to all those cases we saw in the first Mishnah of the chapter about that. And well, a little bit more to the sugya. We'll finish up tomorrow. We're going to have one more last Mishnah about it and start the third chapter. Have a Shabbat Shalom, everyone.